How far would you go if someone was hurting your kid? My son Oliver is 11 years old and has developmental delays that mean he needs extra help at school. For 2 years, his aide Mr. Theodore helped him with daily tasks, and I thought we were so lucky to have him. But then I noticed Oliver getting moodier. I thought he was just getting older, until he started coming home starving every day. He would raid the kitchen like he hadn't eaten in weeks, and when I asked about lunch, he would just freeze up and change the subject. Oliver has always told me everything since he was little, so seeing him shut down terrified me. I asked the cafeteria staff, and they said Oliver hadn't bought lunch in over a month. I didn't understand because I was giving Oliver money for lunch. When I asked him why he wasn't buying lunch, he started crying. "Mom, please don't be mad at me," he whispered. I tried to keep it, but Mr. Theodore says I'm too stupid to have money, and kids like me don't deserve special treats. Hearing my son repeat those words broke my heart. Mr. Theodore had threatened Oliver that if he told anyone, Mr. Theodore would make sure he got sent to a different school away from all his friends. My son told me he was so hungry at school that he would go into the bathroom and eat toilet paper to stop his stomach from hurting. The rage I felt in that moment could have burned down the entire school. Oliver begged me not to say anything because he was so afraid of being sent to another school. I promised him that wouldn't happen, but told him Mr. Theodore could not get away with doing this to him. I went straight to the principal's office the next morning expecting justice. The principal looked me in the eye and said Mr. Theodore had worked there for 15 years without a single complaint. She suggested that maybe Oliver was confused because children with his challenges sometimes have trouble with reality. I demanded she bring Theodore in immediately for a meeting. Theodore walked in with this fake concerned expression like he was worried about Oliver. He started talking about how much he cared for my son and how heartbreaking it was that Oliver was saying these things. When I asked about the missing lunch money, he shook his head sadly. He said Oliver often gets confused and spends money on extra snacks then forgets about it. He looked at me with this pitying expression and said he understood how hard it must be to accept that my child might not always tell the truth. This man who watched Oliver carefully count his lunch money every morning using the special method we taught him, who knew Oliver loved Pizza Fridays more than anything, sat there acting like I was the problem. I wanted to reach across that desk and strangle him, but I kept my voice steady and asked for receipts of these supposed snack purchases. Theodore suddenly remembered he had another student who needed immediate help and left the room. The principal patted my hand and suggested I consider counseling to help me accept Oliver's limitations. That afternoon, Oliver came home with finger-shaped bruises on his arm. When I asked what happened, he went completely silent and just rocked back and forth. All he would say was, "I'm not supposed to tell," over and over again. I realized Theodore had physically hurt my child as punishment for speaking up. I called the school, but they said Theodore reported that Oliver had fallen at recess and he had helped him to the nurse. Full scrap. I started calling other parents and found out 3 other kids with disabilities had suddenly become terrified of Theodore last year. One boy with autism stopped speaking entirely after being moved to Theodore's group. Another parent said their daughter screams when she sees him but can't explain why. A mom told me her son with Down syndrome used to love school, but now throws up every morning before the bus comes. This man had been hunting the most vulnerable children for years, knowing they couldn't defend themselves. The school protected him every single time because they valued their veteran employee over disabled kids. Looking at those bruises on Oliver's little arm made something snap inside me. I knew exactly what I had to do to end this. I was going to destroy him completely. I sat at the kitchen table that whole night with Oliver curled up next to me on the couch. My notebook filled up with dates and times and every single thing Theodore had done. I wrote down the day Oliver came home with wet hands because Theodore wouldn't let him use the bathroom. I wrote about the time Oliver's sandwich disappeared and Theodore said he must have lost it. My hand cramped from writing, but I kept going because every detail mattered now. Oliver kept waking up and crying in his sleep, and I would rub his back until he settled down. The clock on the microwave said 3 in the morning when I finally had everything written down. I made myself a list of exactly what I needed to do to make sure Theodore never touched another kid. When the sun started coming up, I got my phone and carefully pulled up Oliver's sleeve. The bruises were dark purple now with clear finger marks where Theodore had grabbed him. I took picture after picture from every angle and used a ruler to show how big they were. Oliver woke up and watched me but didn't say anything because he knew this was important. I called the school and left a message that we were both sick and wouldn't be there today. Oliver needed to feel safe and I needed time to figure out my next moves without worrying about Theodore getting to him. We spent the morning on the couch watching cartoons while I looked up stuff on my laptop about reporting abuse. I found out about something called mandated reporters and that doctors have to tell CPS if they see signs of abuse. I also learned that I needed to document everything with dates and keep copies of all my reports. Oliver ate 3 bowls of cereal because he was still so hungry from all those missed lunches. Around noon, I called Oliver's doctor and said we needed an emergency appointment because my son had been hurt at the school. The receptionist heard something in my voice and said to come right away. Dr. Ogden had been Oliver's doctor since he was a baby and knew all about his delays and challenges. When he saw the bruises, his whole face changed and he took out a special camera to photograph them. He measured each bruise and wrote notes about the pattern and asked Oliver if anywhere else hurt. Oliver showed him his other arm where there were older yellow bruises I hadn't even noticed. Dr. Ogden looked at me and said these were definitely grab marks from an adult hand. He said he had to report this to CPS by law and started filling out paperwork right there. He also weighed Oliver and said he'd lost 8 pounds in 2 months, which was really bad for a growing kid. That evening after we got home, I sat at my computer and typed out the longest email I'd ever written. I put in every single thing Theodore had done, from the stolen lunch money to the toilet paper to the threats. I wrote about the other parents I'd talked to and their kids who were also scared. I demanded that Theodore be removed from any contact with Oliver immediately while they investigated. My finger shook as I moved the mouse over the send button, but then I clicked it. The next morning, I drove to the school office while Oliver stayed with my neighbor. I told the secretary I needed all the cafeteria records showing what Oliver had bought for the last 2 months. I also wanted any security camera footage from the hallways where Theodore took Oliver. She looked really uncomfortable and said she'd have to check with the principal, but I made her take my written request. I watched her sign it and stamp it with a date, and I took my copy. That afternoon, Dr. Ogden called with the official medical report about Oliver's injuries. He said the bruise patterns matched adult fingers grabbing hard enough to cause deep tissue damage. He'd already sent his report to CPS with photos and measurements and gave me the case number. He said the CPS worker would probably call me within 2 days to set up an interview. Knowing a doctor believed us made me feel less crazy, but also more scared about what else Theodore might have done that we didn't know about. I spent the rest of that day filling out online reports with CPS and calling the state education department's complaint line. The CPS intake worker asked me tons of questions questions and said someone would contact me within 48 hours for sure. The education department gave me a reference number and explained their investigation could take several weeks to complete. I made copies of every single report and confirmation number. I started calling the other parents from my list, and the third mom I reached started crying when I explained why I was calling. Her son used to love talking but hadn't said Theodore's name in months, and kept drawing pictures of a tall man hurting little kids. She said she'd tried to talk to the school, but they said her son was just having behavior issues. We talked for an hour and agreed to back each other up no matter what happened next. That night, after Oliver went to bed, I spread everything out on the dining room table. I got a huge binder from the closet and made tabs for medical records and emails and witness statements. I printed every single email and report and organized them by date. I three-hole punched everything and put it in plastic sleeves to protect them. The binder got thicker and thicker as I added each piece of evidence. I stayed up until 3 in the morning organizing everything and making copies of the most important documents. My phone buzzed with an email from the principal just as I was about to go to bed. She wrote that she'd reviewed my concerns, and while she understood I was upset, Theodore had 15 years of perfect service, and maybe Oliver was just confused about what really happened. She offered to have Theodore apologize to Oliver for any misunderstanding, but said removing him from the classroom wasn't possible without proof of wrongdoing. I wonder what's really driving that principal to protect Theodore so hard when there's clear evidence of bruises right there. The way she keeps talking about his 15 years of service instead of looking at Oliver's injuries makes me curious about what else might be going on at that school. Reading those words made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached. I typed back that Oliver wouldn't be returning to the school until Theodore was removed from his classroom and hit send before I could second guess myself. The next morning, I called the school office and told them Oliver was sick and would be out for the rest of the week. The secretary started asking questions, but I hung up and immediately looked up my rights as a parent. I found out I could volunteer in Oliver's classroom and observe his educational environment. I called back and told the principal I would be volunteering in Oliver's class when he returned next week. She tried to tell me they had enough volunteers, but I cited the law that gave me the right to observe my child's education. She went quiet for a long moment, then said she'd have to check with the district. I told her to put it in writing that I'd be volunteering, and she grudgingly agreed to email me confirmation. While Oliver ate breakfast, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A woman named Amy Norwood introduced herself as a special education advocate who'd heard about our situation from another parent. She said she helped families pro bono when schools violated disability rights. She explained that under IDEA and Section 504, Oliver had specific protections, and the school was breaking federal law by keeping him in an unsafe environment. She told me exactly how to demand an emergency IEP meeting and what words to use to make them take it seriously. Talking to her felt like someone finally turned on a light in a dark room. I took notes on everything she said and thanked her over and over. Following her exact instructions, I typed up a formal request for an emergency IEP meeting to address Oliver's safety needs. I wrote that I was requesting a different aide immediately due to documented abuse concerns. Amy told me to copy the district special education director and the superintendent on the email so the principal couldn't ignore it. She said the law required them to respond within specific time frames or they'd be in violation. I sent the email and felt a tiny bit of hope for the first time in days. That evening while I was tucking Oliver into bed, he grabbed my hand and whispered something that made my blood run cold. He said Theodore would make him stand in the bathroom during recess as punishment when he did something wrong. Theodore would stand guard outside the door, so Oliver couldn't leave until recess was over. This was the same bathroom where Oliver had been eating toilet paper because he was so hungry. I held Oliver while he cried and promised him Theodore would never hurt him again. I wrote down everything he told me in my notebook with the date and time. The next morning, the school attendance officer called to warn me that Oliver's absences needed to stop immediately. She said if he missed any more days, they'd have to report us for truancy. I explained there was an open CPS investigation about abuse at the school, but she just kept repeating the attendance policy like a robot. She said Oliver needed to be in the school unless he had a doctor's note for illness. I realized they were trying to force me to send Oliver back to Theodore. I called our pediatrician and explained the situation, and she immediately wrote a note saying Oliver needed to stay home for mental health reasons. That afternoon, Claire Nunez from CPS arrived for our home visit right on time. She was professional but warm with Oliver, letting him draw pictures while they talked. She asked him gentle questions about school and Theodore without leading him. Oliver told her about the lunch money and showed her the bruises on his arm that were now turning yellow and green. She took photos of everything from multiple angles and wrote detailed notes. She asked Oliver if Theodore had ever hurt him other ways, and Oliver nodded but couldn't say the words. Claire told me she'd be interviewing other students and staff at the school as part of her investigation. Later that day, the district compliance officer Brandon Neely finally called me back. He explained in this patronizing voice that Theodore had union protection that required specific procedures before any disciplinary action. He said the investigation could take months, and during that time, Theodore would remain in his position. He actually said the district had to be careful not to violate Theodore's rights as an employee. I wanted to scream at him about Oliver's rights, but I kept my voice steady and asked what would happen if more children came forward. He said each complaint would be investigated separately according to union guidelines. That evening, I went online and filed a public records request for any previous complaints against Theodore or similar incidents at the school. I requested his personnel file, performance reviews, and any disciplinary records. The district had 30 days to respond, but I wanted to create a paper trail showing I was looking for patterns of abuse. I also requested all emails between the principal and district officials about Oliver's situation. 2 more parents agreed to give me written statements about their children's experiences with Theodore. One mother insisted on staying anonymous because she was scared of retaliation. She wrote about how her daughter would scream and cry when she saw Theodore in the hallway. She said her daughter wet herself in class when Theodore tried to walk her to the bathroom and now refused to use any bathroom at the school. These stories made me feel sick to my stomach, but also more determined to stop him. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making Oliver breakfast, and the principal's voice sounded different, almost careful. She said she'd been thinking about my concerns and wanted to offer a solution that might work for everyone. Oliver could have a different aide starting Monday while they looked into things, but she made it clear this was just to make me feel better, not because anything bad had happened. I grabbed my phone and hit record before she could say another word. She kept talking about how this was a temporary thing to address my worries as a parent, never once saying Oliver needed protection or that Theodore had done anything wrong. I told her I wanted the change to be permanent and the investigation had to be real, not just for show. She said they would do their best, but reminded me that Theodore had rights too as a longtime employee. After hanging up, I went went straight to my laptop and found the private parent Facebook group for our district. I typed carefully, saying parents should watch for signs their kids weren't eating lunch or were scared of certain staff members. Within an hour, there were 47 comments from other parents sharing similar stories. My inbox started filling with private messages, and one stood out from a mom whose son had been in Theodore's group 3 years ago. She said her son started hiding food in his backpack and would cry when anyone tried to take it away. The boy still wouldn't talk about what happened, but she knew something terrible had occurred that year. Amy called that afternoon and said she would come over to help me get ready for the IEP meeting. She brought a thick folder and spread papers across my kitchen table, showing me exactly what to write down and what questions to ask. She taught me to stay calm even when they tried to make me angry, to write down every single thing they said, and to ask for everything in writing. We practiced for 2 hours with her pretending to be the principal trying to dismiss my concerns. She warned me they would try to make it about Oliver's disability instead of Theodore's abuse. The district called the next day to schedule the emergency IEP meeting for the following week. The woman on the phone said their lawyer would be there, and Theodore's union representative had asked to attend too. What should have been about helping Oliver was turning into a legal fight. I said Amy would be there as my advocate, and they couldn't stop her from coming. 2 days later, Claire from CPS knocked on my door for the home visit. She spent an hour looking through all my evidence, taking pictures of the bruises on Oliver's arm, and writing down everything I told her. Then she talked to Oliver alone in his room while I waited in the kitchen, my hands shaking as I heard his small voice through the wall. She came out looking serious and said she believed us, but CPS could only investigate what happened at home, not at the school. She opened a case but warned me these things moved slowly, and the school would probably fight back. That same afternoon, my phone rang, and a man introduced himself as Scottson Novak, a reporter who'd been following problems in our district. Someone in the Facebook group had told him about my post, and he wanted to know more. He said he'd been collecting stories like ours for months and thought there was a pattern. I agreed to send him copies of everything if he promised not to use Oliver's name, and to wait until Oliver was safe before publishing anything. He gave me his direct number and said to call if anything else happened. That night, Oliver woke up screaming, his sheets soaked with sweat as he cried about someone hurting him. He wouldn't go back to sleep unless I stayed in his room, and he started following me to the bathroom, scared to be alone even in our own house. The next morning, he wet his bed for the first time in years. I called 3 different therapists, but the soonest appointment was 6 weeks away. I added him to every waitlist and begged them to call if anything opened up sooner. The school must have found out about the CPS case because they filed their own report 2 days later. Claire called to tell me the school claimed I was emotionally harming Oliver by keeping him home and making false accusations that confused him. They said I was an unstable parent who couldn't accept her child's limitations. The school filing their own CPS report against the mom is like watching someone throw a rock at a glass house they're standing in. They're basically saying, "How dare you report us for hurting your child? That's child abuse." Claire said she knew this was just them trying to defend themselves, and she was keeping our case open. She made notes about how the school was attacking me instead of addressing the abuse claims. A week later, a thick envelope arrived from the school district with the cafeteria payment records I'd requested. I spread them out on the table and matched them with my bank statements showing when I'd added money to Oliver's account. There were gaps on exactly the days Oliver loved most. Every Pizza Friday, every special lunch day when they had chicken nuggets or tacos. Theodore hadn't just stolen randomly, he'd pick the days that would hurt Oliver the most. The cruelty of it made me run to the bathroom and throw up. When I called Brandon about my other records request, he said the district was stalling. They claimed they needed time for legal review and to black out certain information, which could take up to 60 days in complicated cases. He said they were clearly trying to figure out how much trouble they were in before giving me anything. I hung up knowing they were buying time to cover their tracks while Oliver suffered every single day. Amy called me that night and said she was drafting something that would force their hand. I drove to her office the next morning and watched her type with a scary focus, pulling up laws and cases on her computer, while Oliver sat in her waiting room doing homework with his new aide watching him. She printed out 3 pages that basically said Theodore couldn't come within 50 feet of Oliver, no matter what the investigation found. The letter cited something called FAPE, which meant Oliver had the right to learn without being afraid. She attached every medical record and threatened to file with the federal government if they didn't comply within 48 hours. 2 days later, I got a thick envelope from some law firm representing the teachers' union. The letter warned me about defamation and said I was damaging Theodore's reputation without proof. They actually used the word slander and said they would sue me if I kept talking about this publicly. I drove straight to Amy's office and handed it to her. She read it and started laughing, actually laughing, and said this meant they were scared because innocent people don't hire lawyers to threaten parents. I asked Brandon about getting someone to observe the IEP meeting since I didn't trust them, to be honest. The district sent back this long email about student privacy and how other kids could be affected if an outsider came in. Amy explained this was their standard move, but we could record everything ourselves, which they couldn't stop. She helped me buy a small recorder and showed me how to use it without being obvious. I also went back to Dr. Ogden's office and asked him to write something more specific about Oliver's injuries. He pulled up the photos on his computer and typed while I watched, writing that the bruises were consistent with an adult grabbing a child hard enough to leave marks. He added that Oliver's weight loss showed prolonged food deprivation and included a whole section about trauma responses in children. The IEP meeting was 3 weeks later, and I walked in with my folder of evidence and the recorder in my pocket. The district lawyer sat at the end of the table looking smug while the principal shuffled papers and wouldn't make eye contact. I stayed calm even when they tried to talk over me, just kept repeating that Oliver needed a safety plan and a permanent aid change. The lawyer kept interrupting, saying I was making accusations outside the meeting's scope, but I just looked at him and kept talking about Oliver's needs. After 2 hours, they finally agreed to assign a different aide permanently, but the principal actually said Theodore was too valuable to remove from other children based on unproven allegations. I wrote down her exact words in my notebook while she was still talking. Sitting in my car afterward, I felt something shift inside me, like my rage had turned into something colder and more focused. This wasn't just about Oliver anymore, because those other kids deserved protection too. I was going to expose every single person who let this happen. Scottson called me that afternoon asking for copies of everything I had gathered. He said he would keep Oliver's name out of it, but wanted to investigate the pattern going back years. He mentioned finding similar situations with Theodore from 5 years ago, which made me want to throw up. We talked about what he could use and when, setting clear boundaries about protecting Oliver's privacy. CPS finally scheduled Oliver's forensic interview at this special center where they knew how to talk to kids who had been hurt hurt. Oliver was so brave walking into that room with the specialist while I watched through the one-way mirror. He told them about being locked in the bathroom and having his lunch money taken every single day. He described how Theodore would squeeze his arm when he tried to keep his money and call him stupid in front of other kids. Watching my baby describe what happened to him broke something inside me that I knew would never heal. The specialist was so gentle with him, letting him use dolls to show what happened when words got too hard. Oliver even told them about eating toilet paper, which I hadn't known was happening for months. When it was over, Oliver came out and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. The next school board meeting was 2 weeks later, and I signed up for public comment. I stood at that microphone with my prepared statement about the district's failure to protect disabled students from abuse. I didn't say Theodore's name, but I described the pattern clearly enough that everyone knew what I meant. Several board members shifted in their seats looking uncomfortable while the superintendent took notes without looking up once. I talked about vulnerable children being targeted and the system that protected predators over kids. My 3 minutes felt like 3 hours, but I kept my voice steady even when my hands shook. After I sat down, 2 other parents stood up and said they had similar concerns, which made the board members look even more nervous. That night after I got home from the board meeting, my phone buzzed with an email from an address I didn't recognize. The sender attached screenshots of 3 different staff complaints about Theodore from years ago, each one describing him grabbing kids too hard or pushing them when frustrated. Every complaint was marked resolved with no action taken, and the principal's signature was on all of them. The anonymous sender wrote they couldn't come forward publicly because they still worked at the school, but wanted me to know the principal had been protecting Theodore for years. I saved everything to my evidence folder and forwarded it to Amy, who said this showed a clear pattern of covering up abuse. The next morning, Brandon Neely called to schedule a meeting about the investigation process and mentioned Theodore had already hired a private attorney, which meant he was taking this seriously. Brandon warned me that the burden of proof for termination was really high with union protections and suggested I manage my expectations about the outcome. I told him my only expectation was that child abusers don't work with children, and he said he understood, but the process had to follow specific steps. 3 days later, I took Oliver to meet his new aide at the school, and when we walked past the regular bathroom, Oliver completely froze and started shaking. His whole body went rigid and he couldn't move forward no matter how gently I tried to guide him. The new aide saw what was happening and suggested we use the nurse's bathroom instead with a special pass so Oliver wouldn't have to go near the regular one. She wrote him a permanent bathroom pass right there, and Oliver's shoulders relaxed just a little bit. These tiny victories felt huge when everything else was such a fight. The public records request I'd filed weeks ago finally came back with a thick envelope of heavily redacted documents. Between the black marks, I could make out 3 formal concerns about Theodore from previous years, all resolved informally with no investigation. The principal's signature appeared on each resolution form, and one document mentioned a parent withdrawing their complaint after a meeting with administration. I scanned every page and added them to my growing evidence binder that was getting thicker every day. Amy said these documents proved a pattern of the school protecting Theodore instead of students. 2 days later, I got an official letter from the teachers' union saying they'd filed a formal grievance against me for my public board statement. They claimed I'd created a hostile work environment for Theodore and was harassing him without evidence. The district sent a warning letter threatening potential legal action if I continued making public statements about the investigation. Amy helped me draft a response citing whistleblower protections and our right to speak about child safety concerns. She said this was classic intimidation tactics to try to silence me, but we weren't backing down. Oliver finally got off the therapy waitlist and started seeing a trauma specialist twice a week. After 3 sessions, the therapist diagnosed him with acute stress disorder and wrote a detailed letter confirming Oliver's symptoms were consistent with abuse. Watching Oliver walk into those therapy sessions broke my heart because he looked so small and scared, but the therapist said he was making progress. She taught him breathing exercises for when he got scared and gave him a special stuffed animal to squeeze when he felt overwhelmed. The validation from a professional helped, but seeing my son need trauma therapy at 11 years old made me angrier at Theodore and the school. Meanwhile, Scottson had been working on his investigation and called to say another parent agreed to talk on background about their experience with Theodore. Claire keeping the case open while the school scrambles to blame the mom feels like watching someone try to bail water out of a boat they put the holes in themselves. Good luck with that strategy, folks. Their daughter had been in Theodore's group 2 years ago, and the story was exactly the same as Oliver's. Stolen lunch money explained as the child being confused, bathroom incidents, bruises that Theodore said happened at recess. The parent had complained, but got the same response I did about their child's disability making them unreliable. After their daughter graduated to middle school, they thought it was over, but now they wanted to help other families. Scottson said the pattern was becoming undeniable as more families found courage to speak up. The district scheduled a meeting to discuss their investigation method and proposed having an administrator observe Theodore's interactions with students for 2 weeks. I pushed back hard, saying Theodore would just act differently if he knew he was watched. I demanded an independent evaluator with expertise in abuse detection who could observe without Theodore knowing. They claimed budget constraints prevented hiring an outside expert, but I documented their refusal to properly investigate. Amy said their proposed method was designed to find nothing, and we'd use their inadequate response in our federal complaint. Claire from CPS called asking for contact information for the other families willing to talk about Theodore. I spent hours coordinating with 3 sets of parents to make sure their children were prepared for interviews and understood they were safe. The CPS investigation expanded to include multiple victims, and Claire seemed genuinely disturbed by what she was finding. She said the pattern of targeting disabled children who couldn't easily report abuse was one of the worst cases she'd seen. Each family's story added more evidence that Theodore had been hunting vulnerable kids for years, while the school looked the other way. Amy advised filing formal complaints with the Office for Civil Rights and the State Education Department for disability-based harassment. She said federal involvement might be the only thing that would force real action since the district was protecting itself. We spent an entire weekend preparing detailed documentation for multiple agencies, including every piece of evidence we'd gathered. Amy organized everything into separate packets for each agency with cover letters explaining the pattern of abuse and the school's failure to protect disabled students. The federal complaint alone was 40 pages with exhibits and witness statements from other parents. Monday morning, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from a blocked number while I was making Oliver's breakfast. The voice was soft and shaky, like someone was scared of being caught making the call. They said to check the substitute teacher logs for Pizza Fridays and compare who was absent. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it exactly. They hung up without saying anything else. I I dropped Oliver at the school and drove straight to the district office to request those records. The secretary behind the desk looked nervous when I asked for substitute logs going back 2 years. She made me fill out 3 different forms and said it would take 5 business days to process. I told her I'd wait right there while she made copies. She disappeared into a back room for 20 minutes, then came out with a stack of papers. I sat in my car going through every single page with a highlighter. Theodore's name kept showing up as absent on specific Fridays. I cross-checked with my calendar where I'd marked all of Oliver's pizza days. Theodore was out sick or on personal leave for 14 of the 20 pizza Fridays last year. The pattern was too clear to be coincidence. He was deliberately missing the days Oliver looked forward to most. My hands were shaking as I realized this wasn't just random cruelty. This was calculated torture designed to hurt my son in the worst possible way. I drove home and spread all the evidence across my dining room table. Medical reports from Oliver's bruises covered one side. Witness statements from other parents filled the middle section. The substitute logs and attendance records went on the right. I took photos of everything laid out together. Then I started making copies of every single document. 3 complete sets of everything we'd gathered over the past weeks. One package went to the district superintendent with a cover letter demanding immediate action. The second went to Child Protective Services with a formal complaint about institutional abuse. The third went to the Office for Civil Rights as a federal discrimination complaint. I hand-delivered each package myself to make sure they were received. The district office tried to make me leave it at the front desk, but I refused. I walked straight to the superintendent's office and put it in his secretary's hands. She signed a receipt confirming delivery while I watched. At CPS, I waited 2 hours to speak with an intake supervisor directly. They tried to tell me this was a school matter, but I showed them Oliver's bruises in the photos. The supervisor's face changed when she saw the documentation about toilet paper eating. She assigned a caseworker immediately and gave me a case number. The federal building security almost didn't let me in with my thick folder of evidence. I explained I was filing a civil rights complaint and they finally let me through. The OCR office was on the 4th floor behind heavy wooden doors. The intake officer spent an hour going through my documentation while I sat there watching. She asked detailed questions about Oliver's IEP and the school's response to my complaints. 2 days passed before anything happened. Then Thursday afternoon, I got a call from the district's lawyer saying Theodore had been placed on administrative leave. They sent out a carefully worded letter to all parents that mentioned an ongoing investigation. The letter didn't name Theodore, but everyone knew who it meant. My phone started ringing within minutes of the email going out. Some parents were angry that a good teacher was targeted. Others finally felt safe enough to share their own concerns about him. The special education Facebook group exploded into arguments within hours. Parents who'd never had Theodore defended him as a dedicated professional. Parents of kids with disabilities started sharing stories they'd kept quiet for years. One mom said her daughter wet herself rather than ask Theodore for bathroom help. Another parent described finding unexplained bruises on their nonverbal son. The defenders accused us of conducting a witch hunt against an innocent man. I stayed completely silent in the online discussions, but took screenshots of every single comment. Some parents sent me private messages with threats about ruining a good man's career. I documented every message and forwarded them to my lawyer just in case. Meanwhile, the newspaper reporter had been working on his investigation for weeks. His article came out that Sunday on the front page of the local section. He didn't name any children, but included statistics about abuse rates for disabled kids. He quoted disability advocates explaining how predators target vulnerable children who can't report abuse. The article mentioned the district's history of protecting staff over students in previous complaints. It included public records showing 3 other investigations of Theodore that were closed without action. The story got picked up by education websites and disability rights blogs within days. Comments poured in from teachers and parents across the country sharing similar experiences. The teachers' union released a statement Monday defending Theodore's right to due process. They claimed he was scapegoated for systemic problems in special education funding. They suggested helicopter parents were making false accusations when they didn't understand classroom management. The union rep appeared on local news calling this a dangerous precedent for all educators. Some people bought their deflection tactics and started questioning whether we were overreacting. The investigation continued while Theodore collected his full salary sitting at home. CPS interviewed Oliver 3 times with a child psychologist present each time. They also interviewed other students who'd been in Theodore's care over the years. After 6 weeks, CPS sent their final report clearing me of the neglect charges the school had filed. Their investigation found evidence supporting concerns about institutional abuse at the school. They couldn't force Theodore's firing, but their report became part of his permanent record. The district had to acknowledge the CPS findings in their own investigation, whether they wanted to or not. We finally got Oliver's IEP amended after 2 months of meetings and negotiations. The new plan included specific safety protocols for bathroom visits and lunch monitoring. Oliver got a new aide who was patient and actually seemed to care about him. She helped him count his lunch money every morning and sat with him at Pizza Fridays. The safety plan required weekly check-ins with the school counselor to monitor Oliver's well-being. These protections should have existed from the beginning, but at least Oliver was safer now. 3 months after everything started, the district's lawyer called with a settlement offer. Theodore would resign at the end of the school year with a neutral reference letter. The principal would be transferred to a desk job at the central office. The district would implement new training requirements for all aide positions. They wanted sealed records and no admission of wrongdoing in exchange for therapy funding. The settlement included $30,000 for Oliver's counseling and trauma treatment expenses. It felt like they were trying to buy their way out of real accountability for what happened. I pushed back hard during the next meeting with their lawyers. I wanted Theodore's file to show what really happened and demanded new training for all staff members. Theodore being out sick for 14 of 20 Pizza Fridays? That's oddly specific timing for someone who just happens to get sick on the exact days Oliver loves most. What kind of pattern is that supposed to be? They kept shaking their heads and talking about liability, but I wouldn't budge on the lunch monitoring system for kids like Oliver. My lawyer kept kicking me under the table when I raised my voice about documenting everything properly. After 3 hours of back and forth, they finally agreed to some changes, but not everything I wanted. 2 weeks later, the settlement papers arrived, and Theodore had already cleared out his desk without anyone telling me first. The district made us sign papers saying we couldn't talk about what happened publicly, or they'd take back the therapy money. The principal's transfer got announced in an email calling it a great opportunity for her at the district office. The new policies came out in a memo that made them sound like regular updates nobody would even notice. Other parents started calling me asking if they should sue too, but I was so tired I could barely get out of bed. I gave them copies of all my documentation and told them to do what they thought was best. Some of them looked at me like I was a coward fired for taking the settlement instead of fighting harder. They didn't see Oliver wake up screaming every night for 2 months, or watch him check every door lock 3 times. At the school, Oliver started eating lunch again with his new aide sitting right next to him the whole time. He still wouldn't go into the regular bathrooms and held it until he got home most days. His therapist kept saying recovery takes time, and we had to celebrate the small stuff like him smiling at Pizza Friday. The smile wasn't the same as before, but at least it was there on his face again. A thick envelope from the Office for Civil Rights came saying they got our complaint and would investigate over the next 6 months. Even with Theodore gone, maybe the investigation would force them to actually change how they protect kids. I sat at my computer one night typing an email to Theodore's new employer, warning them about what he did. Amy called right as I was about to hit send and reminded me the NDA meant they could sue us for everything. I deleted every word and closed my laptop knowing Oliver needed that therapy money more than I needed revenge. At the next school board meeting, they announced small changes to how they supervise aides without saying why any of it was happening. The principal's transfer got mentioned like she'd won some big promotion to a better job downtown. Most people had already forgotten about our situation and moved on to complaining about the new lunch prices. That's how these places protect themselves, by making everyone forget what really happened and moving on. That night, I tucked Oliver in and he grabbed my hand asking if Mr. Theodore could find our house. I told him no while trying to sound more sure than I actually felt about it. He nodded and closed his eyes while his new nightlight made shadows dance across his bedroom wall. I sat there watching him sleep and promised myself I'd never stop watching for danger, even if my anger had turned into something quieter now. Time to wrap up our commentary adventure. Appreciate you letting me be your clever companion through all the twists and turns. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.